and they will be uploaded by tomorrow afternoon. Today, I'm pleased to have Don Frazier, the Chief Program Officer at Education Design Lab. I'll let Don introduce himself, but we want to give a big thank you for your participation. Don, the room is all yours, and I will interject as questions pop up.
Great. Thank you so much, Melissa. It's a pleasure to join you all, to be a part of the work that you're doing there. We've done some collaboration with the IT Center of Excellence, so it's great to continue that collaboration. As Melissa noted, I am the Chief Program Officer at Education Design Lab. Before assuming that role, which is actually only within the past 6 weeks, I was the architect and lead for our work on micro-credentialing and specifically 21st century skills, which I will talk about some today. But I've been at the lab for closing in on 6 years. So that concept was really just a concept, almost a idea on a napkin when I arrived back in 2015. And now it really is a practice for us at the lab. I'm going to talk a little bit about the lab first, give everybody some background on who we are, what we do, why we do what we do, what our goals are as an organization. We're a national nonprofit based in Washington, D.C. We historically have worked primarily with four-year institutions, but we've seen a dramatic change in that over the past couple of years where we are working a lot more with two-year schools as well. We have a focus on designing and testing and building new models. What does that mean? Most folks hear that and that just sounds like a lot of, just a lot of language and not a lot of substance. Well, it really is about, we get down at the programmatic level to think about how we can design education towards the future of work. And our partners who work with us have that in mind for themselves organizationally, and we work across all different departments and typically out of the president or provost's office, but sometimes also at the faculty level from the ground up as well. So this is just a little overview of how who we've been working with. We are also working more and more with employers, their incumbent workforce, as they try to skill those folks up. And also more and more now at the ecosystem level, we're working with multiple stakeholders in particular areas, including the learning provider, the college, a set of employers, maybe some government agencies, and other groups as well. One of the things that is really essential to what we do is that we design our work with learners. And this is really critical, and I think is one of the hallmarks of what we do here at the lab, which is gather insights from learners, keep learners at the center of this work, which again, I'll talk about a little bit more momentarily. But you can see on the left side of the screen that we work with a group that we often refer to as new majority learners. These are folks who maybe have been underrepresented historically. These are folks who are frontline workers, maybe in low to middle skill jobs, single parents, first generation students and the like. It's a laser-like focus for us. It is part of what we do as far as equity goes, and it's the impact that we want to achieve, which is to move the needle for these populations that are often harder to work with, easier to walk away from. Part of our pedagogy at the lab is to use design thinking. And if you're familiar with design thinking, you'll know that it really came out of product design. And it's this idea of using a systematic approach to problem solving. And there are three key areas. The first, empathy. This is really developing a deep understanding of the needs of either your customer or your student, the learner, but not just hearing one conversation. It is really rolling up your sleeves to get very deep into the insights and pulling those insights from different places and using that as a basis to discover new possibilities, to invent, and then to ultimately to iterate. right? Because the work is never really done if you use design thinking as your pedagogy. It is, okay, we've got something now. How can it continue to improve? How do we iterate? And maybe the iteration comes by learning more, testing with those learners, and then listening to them, and then understanding that you have some new challenges or new opportunities, so you iterate on your solution. So we bring that process to the work that we do with our partners. What does it mean to have to use design thinking? Well, it really is about mindset. So if you look at these four notes on the screen here, getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. Design thinking forces people to move quickly. The process is about rapid testing, rapid prototyping, rapid ideation. So for a lot of folks, particularly in education, I am a lifelong educator, so I can be critical in a way that I've been there, is that we're not often ready to move as quickly as we push people. We encourage folks to let go of traditional mental models. So what has worked in the past may not work going forward, and what you might know and adhere to and believe in might need to be suspended for the moment as we design, as we understand, as we create an event. And then, of course, this idea of exploring what could be. We all know what the constraints are: time, money, right, bandwidth, all these things. We know these, but that doesn't mean we should limit our thinking. So all ideas are possible in the early stages. Ultimately, you design those with criteria that are critical, and then move to a prototype that will actually be something you can test and potentially and hopefully scale. Now, all of this is really the belief system in how we operate the lab. Our founder, Kathleen Delaski, wrote a piece that she pushed out at our 5-year anniversary that really expanded on this learner revolution that we've been talking about now since 2015. And it is this idea that we're moving from an institution-centric model to more of a learner-centric model, right? That this idea that it's all about just the learners coming to you to acquire learning is changing to something that can be and is becoming more of a DIY scenario in which learners can grab learning and acquire learning in many different places now, right? This is the reality. This is the world in which we live right now. You're watching YouTube videos, you're reading blogs on Medium, all sorts of ways, informal and formal, that you can acquire learning. And that learning is becoming more and more valued. So what does that mean to us in higher education when we know that this is the shift that's happening in our nation right now? We also talk about this idea, I mentioned design thinking, human-centered design, learner-centered design, right? Putting the learner at the forefront. So you can see a little bit here again to go more deeply into what this means. It really is creating this structured methodology, right? And a bias towards action. And this is really what we should be doing. You don't have to be well disciplined in design thinking to practice some of this. In fact, when I came to the lab, I really didn't know much at all about design thinking, but I operated in this way naturally. And a lot of people do. There are pieces of this that people say, yeah, I'm always thinking about testing quickly and trying something. I'm always interested in hearing from the potential user, right? So there are some elements that you practice already, but bounding these up and being disciplined about utilizing these can make a world of difference as we think about this shift that's happening. If learners are in many ways going to drive their own education, how do we as institutions become responsive to that? If you're familiar at all with Stanford's open loop university concept from a few years back, that's on the left side of the screen, they talk about this idea that there's this loop, what they call an open loop, where learners will dip in and out of education over time, right? As they're changing careers perhaps, or things are happening in their lives and they dip out of education. Well, we actually think about it as a we, and this is a little bit different, right? So it's this idea that it's not just about these moments of dipping in and out, because education never stops, right? You might be dipping out of formal learning, like you stopped out for a semester, for example, but doesn't mean you're not learning still. You might have a job, you're learning there, and that learning is valuable. You might be raising a child, you're learning there, that learning is valuable. How do we actually understand and appreciate all the learning that people are doing? Because that is the currency. And I'll talk about that a little bit more as well. So the we is what we are really working towards and around right now, and it's happening. It's not science fiction, right? And I'm here really suggesting that colleges have to do a better job to design offerings that respond to the motivation of learners, right? That we know that this is a reality, right? And if school and learning is this constant that goes through all of that, how do we pull in all the other elements of what is happening with learners, what's happening in their life, what's happening in their work? How do we incorporate these in a way that we haven't yet done before to make it that much more applicable and relevant for learners? Okay, so before I go too much further into talking about the 21st century skills and the work that we're doing around the micro-credentials, I want to share a little bit of what's on my mind, because the lab, we are always about looking around the corner, right? We are not an organization that swoops in and we're triage in a moment of despair or trouble. And we've all been living that for quite some time now. We're always thinking about, where is this all going? What is going to happen next? And how might our partners need our help? How can we support the work that our partners are doing on the ground with learners? So I'm just going to talk about a few things. This one is, I think we're all paying attention to, right? This notion that undergraduate student numbers are down, and that's not just in 4 years and 2 year. It's across all institution sectors. And this report was just released fairly recently, a second round report where I think about 76% of colleges were reporting back on this. So we're seeing this downward trend, which isn't just as a result of COVID, right? That in 2019, we were seeing a downward enrollment trend, and it has picked up speed now here in 2020. In this moment, here I am sitting in my room, in my home, and able to work remotely. The reality is that more than 60% of workers cannot work remotely in our economy. So there are many folks who can survive in this moment, but a majority who cannot work remotely. So at the lab, we can celebrate that we can continue to operate at full capacity in this moment. But we're unusual in many ways. And I think this is also important because in moments like these, when we're creating things like online learning where we hadn't had to before because learners were sitting right in front of us, we're celebrating that moment, saying, maybe we can do this going forward. Right? Maybe we can continue this online learning because now we know we can actually do it. We have the capabilities and learners are engaging. But who's being left out? Right? Who's being marginalized? And these are things that keep me up. These are things that are on my mind constantly doing the work that I do and working with institutions. This McKinsey study just came out not too long ago. They're surveying about 800 executives. And one of the things here is that this graph is showing is that demand for on-site freelancers and temporary workers will likely rise over the next 2 years compared to levels prior to COVID-19. And 70% of executives suggesting that they wanted to hire on-site temporary workers and freelancers, right? So this idea too, like you start thinking, where are the jobs, right? If executives are saying we might be hiring more temporary folks when we can be back on site, more freelancers, more contractors, what does that mean for our students who are going into the world of work? This is a reality. This is what's happening, and we have to be responsive to these things. And I think about these all under the umbrella of the future of work and the future of learning. I mentioned this momentarily, a moment ago, about skills being the new currency, right? That, again, when I graduated with my bachelor's in psychology, that was a proxy for a set of skills, both technical and both, people use the word soft skills. And that's really what that signified, right? People had confidence that that bachelor's degree, I was coming to them with a level of preparation in both of those areas. Well, we know that that's really dissolving, right? That employers need more assurances that people have the skills that they need in their workplace. So skills, not degrees, are really going to be the currency going forward. And we're seeing this already. We do a lot of work with HR personnel, and this is what we're hearing, this is what we're seeing, this is what's trending. Also, microlearning, right? Rear end and seat for a long period of time is becoming less desirable for many folks who want to pursue certain skills, training, and learning. Right? They are looking for things that are shorter in duration. We know that competency-based education in many ways is helping us rethink seat time as a model and think about just the ability to acquire those skills and demonstrate that you actually have those skills. So this idea of shorter chunks of learning is also taking off. And it's not even to think about, I use that not to place it up against what happens in the classroom, but actually to think about how you leverage that. Like leverage the fact that I'm walking around with a device like this, right? That there are so many things I can be doing in moments, right? To either enhance my learning, complement my learning that's taking place in the classroom, and also apply that learning. There's this imperative to become a discoverable learner. And I know that sounds a little bit, a little bit lofty, right? And what does that mean? And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But there's actually like a technological grid being built beneath us as we speak, so that learners can actually own their credentials, right? People have heard of blockchain, right? This is what we're talking about, right? This idea that I have these portable credentials that I can display at any point to some third party, like a graduate school that I want to apply to, or an employer who needs to see my credentials. And this is imperative, right? Because if you're not discoverable going forward, then you're essentially out of the game. And then finally, I believe that you're going to see a lot more innovative employer and school partnerships. I mean, we're seeing a lot of this already, but I think now is actually a moment where employers and institutions have not often banded together, right? They've kind of held their camps, and we're going to supply the learners. You're going to hire the talent, right? And now we know that there's going to be a lot more interest, I think, from both sides in ways that we've not seen, to figure out how we can work better with each other so that maybe we, the employers, can supply more applied learning for you, institution, and that you can actually help us also create a stronger pipeline of talent. This idea that we're using machines to build human skills, right? I think the fear that machines are going to take over, right, is something that was out there for a while, right? And probably there are still some people, and we know that some people have lost jobs. So it's a real thing that there are machines who have taken human jobs. But we're seeing a lot more of technology like AI, and we're seeing other technology like AR, augmented reality, virtual reality, to help build human skills, right? The skills that are increasingly in more demand. And then finally, the other thing that I've been thinking about a lot recently is this transition, right? This, IQ, intelligence quotient, to EQ, and emotional intelligence, to LQ, learning intelligence, with the idea that it's good to be curious, for example, to something now that I've been paying a lot of attention to is this idea of AQ, adaptability, right? And certainly the COVID moment has us all adapting in ways that we've not had to before. And those who've been able to demonstrate that they can continue to be successful, to survive and thrive in a moment of turmoil, in a moment of disruption, are demonstrating their ability to be adaptable. And I think this is going to be one that employers are going to pay increasingly more attention to. To what extent are you adaptable? But the question is, like, how do I know? As a learner, how do I know if I am adaptable? Right? And if you're interested in, I would just go ahead and Google this idea of AQ. There are some really interesting things happening out there, some innovative companies that are doing work in this space. And I think it's just kind of an exciting moment. Okay. And then finally, my good friends over at Learning Economy, I can't, these guys are so smart and are doing so much incredible work. I talked about this infrastructure that's being built beneath us, right? This technological infrastructure. They've been talking about this, you see in the left corner, IOE, Internet of Education, right? So we've heard about these things before, right? We've heard about the Internet of Things, for example, right? But this focus on education, right, and this learning economy, right? Again, skills quantified like assets. Skills have currency like degrees. Learning is earning. So when Google or Apple had to map roads so that I can find my way when I'm out and about, what do? They drive every street, right? They have to map every street by driving those roads. Well, in essence, that's what Learning Economy is doing. They're looking at areas and trying to get data to speak to one another. So library systems and educational systems, all these data systems with education to be interoperable, to sync up, because right now they are not. So these guys are doing some amazing work right now in different cities. We're setting up labs across the country. I'm paying very close attention to what they're doing. And, they talk about this idea here. Again, I mentioned the Internet of Education. You can see all these kind of areas they're focusing on: badging and credentialing systems, library and metadata systems, identity systems, right? It goes on, but this is where it's all headed. And it's not science fiction. It's happening right now. To what extent it's happening, we feel in different ways, right? But there's work being done right now, and this work is going to impact us going forward. So I think it's worth, if you're in education, to be paying attention to these types of trends, what may be impacting you going forward. And historically, we have not in education thought too much about the connection between education and the world of work. It was, you handed somebody a diploma, they set off on their journey, and then we wish them luck, right? But now we're recognizing that that's not good enough, right? And of course, the consumers are demanding more of us also in education, that the outcomes need to be there, the employment outcomes. And so we're starting to do a better job of this right now. We're not quite there, right? But there are systems that are going to help us with this as well. Okay, so that's what's on my mind, right? So I just wanted to share a little bit of that because I think it's both valuable in helping me guide what I do when I work with my partners out there, but also to impart some of that knowledge, because in the day-to-day work that you're all doing, you may not have the ability to zoom in on some of these trends going on out there, but this is what we're seeing in the field right now. And we're in some very high-level conversations at the national level that is going to be impacting all of this. So it's an exciting time. I actually think it's an amazing time to be in education right now. So I'm going to spend a few minutes now talking about what are we doing right now on this on the idea of skill building. So I mentioned earlier on that when I came to the lab, it was to build out this idea that we had around 21st century skills. We know that employers, and they still say this, college graduates don't have these skills, right? The skills that I need. It's the skills gap, right? It's been around a long time. We set out to say, well, that's a great challenge, right, to take on. How might we help in this case. So we started working with some institutional partners, and then we also brought in employers. And true to design thinking form, we included many, many stakeholders to help us think about the problem. And the problem is multifaceted. We know that on one hand, that there's a display problem, right? How do learners, students display that they have any of these skills? Well, typically it's on a resume, a one-dimensional resume, a self-reported one-dimensional resume, right? So we know that already, if you're saying you have great oral communication skills, then as an employer, am I going to take your word for it? To what extent do I actually trust this, right? So there's a display issue. Employers don't have a clear line of sight to your capabilities. There's also a language issue. If you were to ask an employer to define critical thinking, it would be much different than if you ask a faculty member, for example, to define critical thinking, or a provost or a college president to define critical thinking. But you're both saying critical thinking is important. If you ask an employer, it sounds a little bit more like problem solving. But we're using the same language. So that's another challenge. So we've got a display issue, we've got a language issue, and then we've got an actual skill building issue, right? To what extent are we being intentional about the acquisition and practice development of these skills? I think that is a tremendous question. I think if you're looking at the K through 20 system, you would argue that a lot of that happens in the early days in elementary school when we're just hoping that students learn how to socialize with one another, right? This idea of building social skills. There's a whole field on SEL, right? And they focus on these skills, many of them at least. So, but then you get to middle school and it becomes a shift where we're talking now more about content. So it's less about these types of skills, more about now academic skills. So it really drops off there, right? And then it just becomes incumbent on the individual to acquire these skills. But it's really hard to think. Like if we just think about this, we stop for a minute and we say, how does one actually get better at collaboration, right? If you just ask that question to yourself, it will be a challenging answer. And if you ask somebody, how do they get better at it? You know, it's not clear where I should even start. Does it just mean I should be in situations where I'm forced to collaborate more? And by doing that, I get better? Maybe, maybe not, right? So there's this problem right now around intentionality as it relates to these skills. And I will say that this is a lifelong challenge, right? Even into adulthood, when you're out of school, how do you get better at these skills? Because it does not end, right? People can be really adept and excellent at some of these skills, but that doesn't mean that you are an expert in every context. I could be a great oral communicator in a moment like this, but I could be a miserable oral communicator with just one person sitting next to me. I'm not saying I am, but that can happen. So there's a lot that we have to try and accomplish here as it relates to these 21st century skills. Now, the 8 that you're looking at here, this is not the only 8, the master 8, top 8. We don't rank order these. These were our first 8. So when we approached this work, we actually just looked at a lot of reports out there. And again, from a design thinking perspective, you're examining all this best work that's happening out there. This is that understand phase. Who's doing what right now? Is it working? To what extent? How is it working? Is it not working? Why not? Right. So you're looking at all this. And we know that between employers and the world of academia, there was this kind of gap, right, around, are we saying the same thing about these skills? So we set out to really fill that gap, right, to bring both sides together in the development of the framework that we were putting together. So we were looking at all these lists of which are the most important skills, and these are the ones that we decided we wanted to tackle first. What we realized, though, in this work that we were doing with employers technologists, subject matter experts, all these people we were interviewing, was that just that question I asked before, how do I get better? I would ask somebody, what makes for a good collaboration? And I asked these experts. I would even look at groups like Herman Miller, the furniture company that has written a lot about how space informs collaboration or improves collaboration. And what I kept hearing and seeing was some of the similar language over and over again, no matter who I was talking to. And that was an aha. That was us hearing people say that there's another set of skills. It's just about collaboration, oral communication, or empathy. There's some other skills beneath that that you actually have to be good at to be considered good at empathy, good at oral communication, good at collaboration. So these sub-competencies were a big aha for us at the lab. And we realized that if we want to help learners get better, answer that question, how do I get better? Like, okay, we'll start by recognizing these sub-competencies. What are these sub-competencies, the other skills? In the same way that you think about any skill, playing the guitar, playing soccer, any other skill. There's a whole set of micro skills or sub-competencies, footwork, agility, heading the ball, kicking the ball, right? That all roll up into being better at soccer. Same thing for these skills. So that's what we set out to do. And this map that you're looking at demonstrates what these competencies are beneath each of the skills. So this essentially what we figured was a core 4, although there's more than 4. I'll also say that. But we said this building block of 4 seems to be the foundation on which we can actually build a learning experience. There's overlap here. So you can see these lines cutting across here that, for example, listening actively shows up in oral communication, also in empathy, also in collaboration. So there's some crossover around the skills. And we also realize that there's this formula, right, for acquiring 21st century skills, which is not unlike all the learning science out there that says when you apply learning, you learn it better, right? It sticks with you. It means more to you. You can make more meaning out of it. And so we realized if we're going to build a learning experience, it had to do these things and to allow you to practice the skill and to allow you to reflect on that practice, reflect on your learning, had to have an assessment component, right? If I don't know my starting point, how do I actually know if I'm getting better? If I know I'm getting better, how much better have I gotten, right? So some baseline. So this is what we set out to do when we were thinking about these skills. And if you think about that for a moment, you just think like, this is how we learn best. To what extent are we doing this in all that we do right now, in all the learning we're trying to provide? Are we providing enough opportunities to practice? Are we providing enough opportunities for folks to reflect, to think about their thinking? And I would argue that we probably don't do enough of that, right? We need to get through a certain amount of content. And then the practice, contribution, right? All the grinding, that sticky stuff right in the middle is the harder work, right? And how do we provide that? Well, that's maybe, again, where these partnerships come into play. That's why we do internships, for example, right? So it may not have to happen all in the classroom. I'm here suggesting that everybody who's teaching a course needs to make sure this is all happening, right? This is the idea that we need a more holistic approach to figuring out how we allow learners to practice, to do more, to apply, to assess, to iterate, to continue to grow, to apply it in different contexts. We developed a set of what we call proving ground assessments. Really, they are performance-based assessments. I'm going to go back for a minute when I said that employers don't have a line of sight into an individual's skills and capabilities, their 21st century skills. It meant that they needed to see it, right? Because you hear employers, HR folks say, I know it when I see it, in these skills, right? Or they might say, I know it when I don't see it. So how are we going to help them see it, right? So the idea of a performance-based assessment that is, in essence, a workplace-based scenario, something you'd actually have to do when I bring you in here on day one. If you can show me how you did that, you can show me how you applied your oral communication skills to that challenge, that gives me more confidence that you can do it on day one when you get here. So this is ongoing work right now, and we're seeing a lot right now in this assessment space. So I didn't put it down earlier as this big trend that's happening. We're focused a lot on this right now. Right? We're thinking about this idea of assessment, and you know, of course, when I say the word assessment, you know, people start to think about biases, for example. Right? People start to think about you know, problems with assessments, or they start to go to, well, what's the validity of that assessment? Right? So I think when I say the word assessment, we have to let go. Remember that idea earlier about design thinking, mental models? We have to let go of what immediately comes to us when we say the word assessment and think about new forms of assessment, new ways for people to demonstrate that they have the capabilities that somebody is looking for. Right? So we're spending a lot of time in this space right now. I talked about some of these AI companies doing this work, some of these VR companies doing this work, really trying to provide new ways to give that window in, that line of sight. So this is interesting, and we put these proving grounds in front of employers, these assessments that we've created, and some of them have just said, if I can see the result of that right there, I'll hire you off of the result of that alone. Right? I don't need to see the resume. Show me the results of that assessment. Wow. You know, when you hear things like that, you know you're in a moment, right? You know there's something going on here. The market signal. It's something happening that we have to pay attention to, that we have to respond to. So that's, you know, this is where the lab is like doing our, you know, maybe one of the reasons we like to call ourselves a lab is that we're looking at these spaces right now and saying, how do we do this better? How do we provide learners the opportunity to assess these capabilities, demonstrate these capabilities? I'll talk a little bit about, you know, this idea of the micro-credentials. So people ask us, so well, what does it mean? Like, what do they do to earn this badge, right? So I'll just really quickly just talk about the fact that we knew we had to make it rigorous. In the early days when we started doing this work, we said the word badge in a room of academics, and sometimes we just got laughed out of that room, right? Because people didn't want to hear the word badge. They didn't want to hear that there was another type of credential that may be of value. This is not a threat to the existing credential, right? This is a complement to an existing credential. So badge, a more discrete form of learning, right, that then allows that learner to display that discrete set of skills is just a good thing, right? So we design these to be, in essence, about worth 1 credit. So, you know, a language that I know is familiar to folks, our partners in academia. You know, I've already talked a little bit about this, you know, this idea that it's ongoing targeted learning and practice. We put together content that podcasts, videos, reports, you know, articles, lots of different forms of learning, and then multiple forms of assessment as well. So learners go through this type of experience on the way to earning a digital badge in any of these skills. And I will remind you that just earning a badge doesn't mean I'm done, I'm good for life, right? It doesn't mean you're a ninja at these skills. It's a signal at that moment, right, that you have actually gone through some intentional work. And I've earned that badge. Now, again, put you in another context, and maybe you're not as strong there. So it's a signal of a moment, right? But I do believe, as this slide demonstrates, that students feel better prepared after going through this experience, right? They feel more knowledgeable. They feel like they can activate the skill in a workplace. They feel that they can excel without supervision, and they actually feel like they are more comfortable with critical feedback. These are all things that employers love to hear, by the way. This is kind of a neat part about digital badges. If you're not familiar with what's kind of going on here, right, is that this is a screenshot. So the Lab's Resilience Badge living on the credibly acclaimed platform. You can see some skill tags beneath this. So skills, demonstrate self-awareness, exhibit flexibility, focus on solutions, right? These are the sub-competencies I talked about. was core 4, and resilience also circled. So if I'm an employer, for example, or I'm a learner, right? If I want to click on resilience, circled here, if I decide to click on that, it's actually going to bring me to real-time job openings. Right, so now skills are being synced up, the credential, syncing to skills, syncing to job openings, syncing to jobs and employers, right? So I can actually start to drill down and filter. Okay, now I want to see which jobs in my area, for example, in my field, where employers are saying they're looking for resilience because I've earned a credential, right? So you have the ability to do that as a learner. And vice versa, employers can actually go onto a platform like this, say, I want to find people who have earned a credential in resilience or oral communication or collaboration, because those are critical skills for my place of business. I can actually find you. Now, you have to be willing to be discovered, but that's what I said before, discoverability, right? This idea that you can become discoverable. Imagine somebody who doesn't have a network, a parent who's going to pick up a phone, get you a job interview, a friend who's going to make that connection. You don't have that, right? Get in the game in this way, right? And you can actually be discoverable. Right, so this is a growing trend also, and I'm very encouraged by this, particularly when we talk about who the lab is focused on serving. Here's just a quote from one of our friends in the field who talked about the badge being a way to separate students from other potential applicants. She's talking about our 21st century skill badges here, but I will say that this conversation is about micro-credentials, digital badges writ large, right? I'm talking about an example, our example, the work that we've done in that space, but this is the future, right? Visibility of a learner's skills. This is where it's headed. This is what we have to focus on. This is our imperative, making learning visible. How do we do that? How do we help them? How do we help learners do this, right? What's our responsibility, our role? How can we do this? Right, so we at the lab, this is a big focus for us. We're spending a lot of time and energy focused on this, and then working with our partners to help them do this. So for those folks who are working with us, and I know there are some schools already across the state of Minnesota who are working with us on this, but working with many other schools right now, trying to figure out how can we help you, particularly related to these 21st century skills. So we've created a platform called Visible Learning that allows us to sync our skills to your LMS. This is work that we're doing right now, so we're excited about that. But this is the future. Micro-credentials are the future. 62% of employers exploring skills-based hiring, right? This transformation of what is happening in the marketplace right now. Market signals. These are the things we have to pay attention to, right? Employers need workers who are agile, adaptable, right? And colleges, really interesting, and I'm loving this right now, that colleges are unlocking degrees, right? So they're willing to look at a degree and say, well, what's most important here, right? And what may need to be substituted? How might I pull in some industry certification or credential to complement this course of study, this degree? So you're seeing some unlocking and then bundling, rebundling, right? So these trends is all afoot right now. And as we're all thinking about where it needs to go, well, knowing what the market is calling for, knowing what our obligation should be to learners, we have to think more creatively. Right? And COVID is certainly accelerating this. Right? So it felt very long distance a year ago, but it is no longer long. It is on us right now. Right? We've got an economic crisis. We've got an employment crisis right now. And it is just, we don't know when this is going. I mean, there's no, people say this is going to be multiple years before we get back to the point where we're economically sound where people are back to work in the way that we hope. So what can we be doing as institutions of higher ed to respond to this? 21st century skills, more important than ever. So even though I'm up here just talking about the world in general and what's happening, everywhere we turn, we're hearing more and more people talk about the importance of 21st century skills. Like this visual right here, Strada's Future of Work. What this demonstrates that across a 100-year work life, you will have many careers. Those white spikes are areas of technical expertise that you will require over that time, over many decades of work. And that you've got these human skills, as they refer to them, that cut across, right? No matter what industry, what job role, they are important, they are critical. Some more important than others in particular jobs, but they are incredibly important. And finally, a lot of research that is showing that other types of certifications are creating more equity in the workplace than degrees, right? So shifts are happening. We need to understand what those are. We need to embrace them. We need to work within them, right? And they will continue to shift. But this is what's going on in the field right now. I'm going to just close on this quote right here, right? It is a time for innovation. I love this quote. A great idea executed brilliantly and communicated in a way that is both intuitive and fully celebrates the magic of the initial concept. Innovation. It needs to either create a new market or radically change an existing one. And that's where we are. Radically change this existing market. And now is that moment. And I'm enthusiastic, excited, and hopeful about what I'm seeing out there. So I'm going to close on that and see if there are any questions from the audience, and I will turn it back to Melissa.
Thanks, Don. So we did have a couple of questions. First, Julie asked, how do we implement some of these non-traditional learnings at a traditional university? Traditional higher ed tends to not accept these types of learnings as rigorous, nor does anything happen quickly. Letting go of established practices also does not happen easily.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Julie. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, when I talked about being laughed out of the room, right? A lot of it was because of that, right? It was just like, we can't get there, right? And you know, we've worked with now probably close to 100 different types of schools, 2- and 4-year schools that have figured out how to do this, right? That they're, because it doesn't often, and this is my challenge at the moment, right? That we have presidents who would say, they look at those 8 skills, for example, and they say, I want every one of my graduates to have these skills, right? Nobody's going to argue with that. I want them all to have, okay, but how are we making that happen is the question, right? And then you have people within the institution who are willing to try. So oftentimes it has to be something that bubbles up from the bottom up, right? Where we have individual faculty, program managers who are just saying, I'm going to do this in my space because I can, and I know it's important. I control my domain, so I'm going to try. I would like it to be something that is coming from the top down, that is saying, this is our mandate as an institution. And there are many ways that we can do this, not just this way, right? There are many ways. So let's think about the ways that we could do this. And part of it is there's some very easy lift, because a lot of it's happening already, right? We're just not calling it out, right? So we would sometimes just sit with a faculty member and say, where do you think that which of these skills do you think is happening in your classroom, and how? And then ask them, like, well, are you telling students, well, this is actually, you're doing creative problem solving here? You know, and oftentimes this is the challenge, right? Because if I'm a learner who's graduating and really don't know what it means, creative problem solving, if I've heard from teachers along the way, this is creative, do you know this is creative problem solving? Like, then it becomes part of your narrative. Like, I actually have done some creative problem solving. I think about my course with Julie. I think about my class with Melissa, right? Like, so there are small ways that we have to get there, and that you're right, change is hard within higher education and education generally, right? But I think this moment, as we've seen, People say like, we can't put our courses online. COVID, courses are online, right? And they're working to make it happen, right? So a catastrophe has accelerated that reality. So people who said we can't do it, Manor should do it. And I would say, were students graduating and not being hired at all by employers, then probably would say that's another catastrophe. And employers said, I'm not hiring your students till they have these skills. Then all of a sudden you figure out how to do it, right? So we're not there. But the reality is that employers are struggling. And regardless of what employers care or think, this should be our imperative. This is a moral obligation for us. So I think it's a just change in narrative and approach that is one way to start.
Perfect. Chad asked, if I'm a college professor, how should I be adapting to this new future of work and learning? What challenge or what changes should I be looking to make in my courses and or in my department?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one great way, right? And I think this is hard, right? Well, it's not really hard, but I think it's just hard to find the space for this. If you're teaching in a particular field and like these are the jobs that students who come through, my course might be seeking. Well, have you talked to an employer recently just to get some input from them, right? Fascinating conversations happen when we have faculty and employers in the room, when we have deans and employers in the room, right? And I will say that that's a 2 and 4 years, because just because 2 years who have advisory boards for their programs with employers, these are different conversations, right? Critical conversations that need to happen. So it's just a moment of listening, right? And employers are willing to lean in on this, right? So if you're a faculty member teaching, what do I need to do, employer? Maybe it's an employer, a local employer who hires a lot of your students. What do you like about our students, right? And where do you think they could be better? Just start a conversation, because I think that helps inform how you can make small changes in your classroom, right? Nobody's talking about tearing down a course, right? Small changes can make a huge difference. So I think just a step to speak with somebody like a hiring manager who already loves your students, who hires your students, be very open. And I'm sure pre-COVID, you had them on your campus. You could find them, you get access to them, talk to the Career Center, say, I'd love to be able to sit in on something, for example, with an employer. I think there's some small ways you could do it.
Okay, Julie had another question. When I was a Girl Scout, I worked really hard and was so proud of my badges. Is there a concept of creating aligned pathways with youth organizations like that to encourage future learning?
Absolutely. It's a great point. And we've worked with some different programs like that, but we've mostly operated, as I mentioned, in the post-secondary space, but we've obviously often talk about like, well, when does it start? These skills don't start being developed when you set foot on a college campus. So how can we actually roll it back? Well, we have some schools that are doing things like dual enrollment, right? So they're working with high schools, for example, or other programs. We have one partner in Maine working with a 4-H program. So I think this would be a great place. It's a fertile ground for sure, Julie, when thinking about some of what is already being developed at some of these programs, these community-based organizations, where it is as much a focus on these skills as it is, any other types of skills that you might be building in that program. So, drawing a clear line that means like, hey, you've done that, now you're going to continue that when you get here, right? This is harder, I think, right? Because this chasm still exists between kind of secondary and post-secondary around, you bring in what you've learned, but now, okay, now you're going to learn all this new stuff, right? And it's not about how we incorporate what you learned or, skills or abilities you had before. Like, that's on you as an individual learner to figure that out, right? But we're not really thinking about that. So some of that may happen, I think, outside the classroom, right? And I think there's a role for co-curricular to play in some of that. All those things you did before, sports you played, programs you're involved in, like how do you build on those things?
Okay, and then one final question from Sean. Have you seen a difference between the type of professionals, IT service, etc.?
As far as the skills that they are looking for, is that the question?
Yes, I would venture as much.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are definitely some commonalities, right? So, for example, in the technical space, we've seen quite a bit of where you have some folks who are saying, I can't put you on a team, right? You've got the technical chops, you can code, right? But I cannot put you on a team. So collaboration is critical, right? I can't put you in front of a client. So oral communication is critical. So we're seeing some overlap, regardless of job role, that in certain sectors, there are skills that matter more, right? How empathetic do you need to be in that is questionable, right? Like, I mean, not saying empathy is not important, right? But we sit with HR folks and we say, which are the most important skills for that job role right there? And when you ask them that question, they will tell you, here are the top three, right? Bang, bang, bang. And yes, I do see that for certain job roles. And also, there's obviously technical oral communication skills, right? That are going to be different based upon the industry. But there's a clear baseline of capabilities, regardless of industry, that I think employers are looking for. They don't expect you to be coming out of college to be, super knowledgeable at a extreme depth. But they're looking for something, right? Like, you got to give me something at this baseline, right? That shows me that you know how to collaborate, you know how to communicate. So there's overlap for sure, and I think that's the area we should be focusing on.
Great. Wilson asked that you mentioned the lab is working more and more with two-year schools. Can you tell us what some of the most interesting developments are in the two-year part of the ecosystem?
Sure. I think the most interesting part right now for us is, we're embarking on this work around micro pathways. And, that's like another webinar in and of itself. But micro pathway is this idea that, we're trying to move somebody very quickly from maybe a low paying job in a particular industry like allied health. Maybe you're making $12 an hour in this job here. And we're going to move you very quickly to something where you can earn $28 an hour, right? And it's how do you get from here to there quickly, right? This idea of skill adjacencies. It's how do you jump from, like, not climb one rung in the ladder, but maybe jump to the next ladder here, right? So this is the work going on right now. We just launched some work around our Community College Growth Engine Fund, where we're paying close attention to this, and we're building these micro pathways across different industries. And we've got 6 community colleges that are working with us on this, each committed to build 3 unique micro pathways in some different industries. Construction, health is a big one, energy. So there's a lot of high demand, and we're really, the goal here is not just get you to some $28 an hour job, but it's about trajectory and mobility, right? And that has been pretty exciting, and it's going to be really employer-led in many ways, right? So a little bit of flipping the paradigm here around how we're going to design this educational pathway is going to be very informed by the employer, and that's what the two-year schools are signing up for.
Great. Well, it looks like